The last few months have weighed heavily on the German government. The coalition almost fell apart. There's been violence and hatred on the streets of Germany, and the domestic intelligence chief was accused of going soft on the far right. My guest this week here in Strasbourg is David McAllister. He's chair of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee and a former regional prime minister in Germany. Is Angela Merkel on the way out? David McAllister, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you.
Let's talk first, if we may, about the migrant issue. The situation may have eased in the sense that far fewer people are coming to Germany and the rest of Europe, but the political fallout is killing the CDU. It's killing your government, isn't it?
This issue isn't killing my party. This issue is a major challenge for Germany and the whole European Union. The numbers have come down since 2015, but of course we have to make sure that the numbers stay at the level they are now, and this means that we have to understand in the European Union that in the Schengen area without border controls, our external borders are the European external borders, and we have to protect them better.
Yeah, but you say it's not killing you. The coalition almost fell apart in the summer, didn't it? Intense squabbling over refugees, intense squabbling over the violence, the country's intelligence chief, scandal after scandal. The SPD party, Social Democratic Party, Lars Klingbeil, called it a state of permanent crisis. So it is killing your party.
Well, undoubtedly we have gone through some turbulent weeks and months in Germany. I welcome that the three coalition parties, the CDU, the CSU and the Social Democrats, have now agreed to concentrate on the issues, and this is exactly what German citizens are expecting.
You've patched up a compromise. You haven't done anything more than that, haven't you? I mean, the fact is that by the standards of your government, the far-right AfD is looking pretty strong and stable, isn't it?
Well, if you're in politics, you always have to be ready to find compromises, and if you're in a coalition government with three parties, you have to be ready also to strike deals and find compromises. This is
I notice you ignore what I said about the AfD.
But this is what daily governmental work is about. Now,
the AfD is growing, it's strong, it's stable. In some polls, it's the second party in Germany.
Yes, and undoubtedly this is a worrying development.
You played it down a month ago. You said the threat of the AfD didn't worry you so much because 85% of Germans didn't vote for radical right wing.
Well, that's a matter of fact. 15% for the AfD in the polls is for me far too high, and I wish that the numbers would come down. And I seriously believe that a German Bundestag without the Alternative für Deutschland would be a better place than with the AfD.
But they're driving the narrative, they're driving the debate about immigration. The fact that it was only 15% of Germans who voted for them is neither here nor there. They're in charge of the narrative, aren't they?
No, they're not in charge of the narrative. These people in the AfD are giving very, very simple, I would say simplistic answers to very complex questions, and we have to make clear that politics is more than just giving simple answers. You have to work hard, and that's why I welcome that the government has now finally decided to go back to work, to concentrate on the serious issues. What we have to avoid is internal party fighting and also internal coalition fighting. It's normal to look for compromises in a coalition, but what we experienced in the last few weeks wasn't very helpful, and the only party which really benefited was the AfD. You're right there. That's why the better work we deliver, the better we can make possible that the AfD will go down in numbers again.
Well, you are looking then for complicated answers, but while you're doing that, 1 million CDU, CSU voters have defected to the AfD. So it's not going very well for you, is it?
Well, if the AfD is in the polls now about between 16 and 17%, one thing is obvious. They're getting voters from all parties. Yes, they're getting voters from our party, but also hundreds of thousands of people who voted for the Social Democrats at the last elections also voted for the AfD. So the AfD is a challenge for the whole political system in Germany, not only for my party.
And you've been far too complacent about them in the past. Last year, one of the AfD founders, Alexander Gauland, went so far as to say that Germans should be proud of what their armies did during the 2 world wars. He was pushing the boundaries, and he got away with it, didn't he?
Well, what the AfD leadership is doing, they're pushing the boundaries week by week, and I think this is appalling. And clearly the AfD has shown in the last few weeks and months that now they are not drawing borders which are necessary between the radical right and the conservative right, and that's why the AfD is responsible. And I am for a very serious debate with the AfD, making clear that we will not accept right-wing populism, nationalism and racism in Germany.
Yeah, you may not accept it, but look at the effect on Germany. Recent polls by Forza, one of Germany's most respected polling organizations, reports that more than 1 in 4 Germans now believe Islam arouses fear. So by pressing that fear button, they really are changing the political mood in Germany, whether you like it or not.
Millions of Muslim citizens in Germany are now an integral part of our society. These people...
No, but 1 in 4 Germans think Islam arouses fear. Is that a happy state of affairs for you?
And that's why we have to make clear that the huge majority of Muslims living in Germany are playing according to the rules, are following the law, and that we have to make clear that those who are not following our rules and our laws will have to be taken to court like any other German citizens. I want to see I want to see an inclusive German society, and this includes now millions of Muslim citizens who have come from other parts of the world to Germany to stay in Germany, and they are welcome to become German citizens, and this country is also their country.
How do you make that clear when your Chancellor, Angela Merkel, is already looking more and more like a wounded animal, isn't it? She lost a key ally when her choice to lead her parliamentary group was booted out last month. Very embarrassing defeat for her, because she had made a special plea saying that Volker Kauder was crucial to the stability of her government. She lost, so we have to assume that her government is less stable as a result of that, to take her at her own words. Much less stable, in fact.
That Volker Kauder was voted out as leader of the CDU-CSU parliamentary group in the Bundestag was a surprise. This is unusual for my political party, but this is democracy.
It was not a surprise, it was a huge defeat for her personally,
Well,
wasn't
Angela
it?
Merkel herself said that this was a defeat, but this happens in a democracy. The parliamentary party decided to vote for Ralph Brinkhaus. Now, Ralph Brinkhaus has been the vice chairman of the CDU-CSU group in the last years, and he announced that he wouldn't change the policy of the group, and he's also been very supportive of Angela Merkel. So, yes...
You can't spin it as a success, David McAllister.
But
This is a major defeat for her. As Günther Oettinger, the EU budget commissioner, said, she's a lame duck now. You said this 6 days ago.
Angela Merkel is the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany.
A vulnerable, extremely vulnerable Chancellor.
She will presumably run again as CDU chairwoman at our party conference at the beginning of December. I would support this. Ralph Brinkhaus has endorsed her candidature. So we have a change in the leadership of the CDU group. This might mean a slight change in the way politics are presented in the German Bundestag. It might be a fresh start for the CDU-CSU group. But I believe that
Fresh
Angela
start is
Merkel...
not the start they wanted, and if your party does badly in regional elections in Hesse and Bavaria, it's going to be real pressure on her to go, won't there?
Well, first of all, we've got to wait until the elections actually take place. I don't trust
People aren't
polls
waiting. One CDU official told the Financial Times the other day, I can imagine the entire senior party leadership coming under pressure to resign, and that includes Merkel. So the vultures are gathering around her, aren't they?
Well, in the
CDU.
moment, we're concentrating on the regional elections in Bavaria on the 14th of October and a fortnight later in Hessen, and then we will see. What the polls are showing is that at a lower level, of course, but still the CDU in Hessen and the CSU in Bavaria are by far the strongest party, and we will probably lead the two governments once again in these federal states. But of course, we will have to look for coalition partners. Look, we've been going through a number of very turbulent weeks in German politics.
And her luck is running out, isn't it? The momentum is drifting away from her. She no longer has the momentum. She looks vulnerable. She looks weak. She can't get her way in the party. She can't get her allies voted in.
I don't know what it's like in other countries, but I can tell you for Germany that ups and downs in politics are nothing very special. Of course, I would like to see us doing better in the polls at the moment, but I'm very sure once we're back on track, doing serious work in Berlin, in the government, then the approval rates will go up again.
In June, you agreed a migration compromise inside the EU, again it had many holes in it. Rescued migrants would be sent to control centres across Europe, but no one agreed on the locations, so nobody knows where that's going to happen or how it's going to happen. No country would be forced to have these control centres. Easy to get an agreement when there are no demands being made on any of the people who sign up to it, isn't it? The agreement's meaningless, isn't it?
I believe that the migration crisis can only be solved at a European level, not at a national level.
It's not being solved at a European level, is it? It's not being solved.
Well, it's the largest challenge for us in the European Union. It's a challenge which will stay for years and even decades. And what we have to do now is to protect our external borders better. We will step up Frontex up to 10,000 Frontex servants till 2020. We have to fight the root causes of migration, especially in Africa, and we have to get our priorities right in national legislation, what we can do that those people who come to Europe, who are fleeing from war, civil war, who are afraid of their lives, can actually find humanitarian protection. But on the other hand, those people who are coming for economic reasons but are claiming asylum will have to be sent back to the countries where they came from.
The UN is not impressed with the so-called deals that you've had. It expressed serious concern last month about the so-called deal and warned that proposals being discussed risk compromising human rights and humanitarian principles.
But what we have to do
you don't care about those.
We have to break the business model of the smugglers. It cannot be that criminals decide who can actually reach Europe if they put people taking their money onto boats, onto a very dangerous, risky trip across the Mediterranean.
But the UN says these measures are nothing more than an attempt to regain the political initiative from the far right.
Well, Europe has shown humanitarian responsibility in the last years. We have taken hundreds of thousands, millions of refugees, and we will continue to show our humanitarian responsibility. But one thing is clear, not everyone from Africa can come to Europe, so we have to cooperate better with neighboring countries, and the EU and Turkey struck a deal which solved the migration route on the Western Balkan route, and now we have to find similar compromise with the countries in Africa. This is not easy, but we are talking, for instance, with Egypt, how we can cooperate better.
I'll come on to Egypt a bit later, but your policy of allowing 1.4 million migrants to come to Germany was the biggest recruitment tool that the AfD could possibly have had, and far-right parties around Europe, wasn't it? Across 22 European countries, support for populist radical right party has never been higher in 30 years. That's quite an achievement, and that's traceable right back to your humanitarian policies, isn't it?
2015 was a unique situation. Since then,
you made it a unique situation.
No, but these people were already on their way, and Germany and other countries like Austria, Sweden, the Netherlands showed responsibility in a very challenging situation. Now, since then, the numbers have gone down by nearly 90%.
But the proportion of people dying, Mr. McAllister, the proportion of people dying on the Mediterranean route is actually going up. It's actually going up, as the UN said. Now we have 1 in every 18 people who are crossing the central Mediterranean dying. Before it was 1 in 42. So there's nothing to feel complacent about or happy about or pleased about, is there, with the policy, because the proportion of people dying has gone up.
Well, you were just referring to the situation in 2015, and since then we have brought the numbers down. But still, every single human being who dies in the Mediterranean is one too much. That's why we have to break the business case of the smugglers. We should prevent people from actually getting on these boats, and that's why we should decide who can come to Europe or not, if it's possible, on African territory, in Northern Africa, but of course only according to our very high standards when it comes to human rights and the dignity of human beings.
Well, let's talk about that, because you have been calling for a Marshall Plan for Africa, but which sounds great. But the endemic corruption of some of your target countries, let's take Niger and Sudan, for instance, seems to have been totally ignored by the EU. I mean, attempts to make aid conditional on stopping the human smuggling may actually have made the situation worse, haven't they? Because you're dealing with countries that are themselves part of the problem. Governments, repressive governments that are part of the problem, why people are leaving. You're not changing the governments, you're paying the oppressors, aren't you?
I've been to Africa 9 times since 2014, and something which I am very convinced of is the future of Europe is very closely linked to the future of our neighboring continent, Africa. And what we need to develop is a new policy on Africa which will combine elements of our foreign policy, our foreign trade policy, our neighbourhood policy and our development policy.
How does that deal with the corruption, the massive corruption and the repression? How does that deal with that?
Well, I welcome the attempts of the German government and other governments to actually talk about a Marshall Plan not for Africa, but with Africa. What we need is a debate on eye level with the African countries, and of course some African countries are doing better than others, but what we have to do is fight the root causes, and that means in the first case, if people are leaving Africa because they don't have a perspective, because the youth unemployment is so high, if people can't feed their families, if they don't have jobs, that's what we have to do. But of course we also have to improve the track record of African governments when it comes to the rule of law, democracy and other issues.
You're not. I mean, as Transparency International reported in July, while roughly 43% of Africans are living in poverty, $50 billion worth of stolen assets leaves the continent every year.
Well,
it's like pouring water into a basin that doesn't have a plug in it.
Well, you have to.
The money just goes out.
Well, you have to differentiate
again.
in Africa. You have countries which are doing better, and you have countries with a negative track record.
But let's look at the ones you're dealing with. The so-called Khartoum process, for instance.
Yes.
States such as Sudan, Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia, South Sudan, all taking part in EU initiatives, all themselves responsible for brutal repression that is making people leave. So you are dealing with the oppressors, and as I said before, funding them.
We can't choose our governments. We can't choose our leaders in Africa. We have to deal with those who are there. But one thing is key, and European policy has always been like this, it's more for more and less for less. And those countries which are following our European values when it comes to democracy, the rule of law, human dignity, gender equality.
Are there any?
Well,
Which ones are?
Well, if you look, for instance, in Northern Africa, for instance, Tunisia, I believe, is a success story. It's
a very partial success story.
Well, it's a partial success story, but look, if we had the approach in Europe that we would only be talking and dealing with like-minded countries, we would very soon be reduced to Australia, New Zealand, South Korea and Japan.
It's not dealing with like-minded countries, it's doing things that work.
Well, exactly.
That's the difference, isn't it? It's doing things that actually produce the result you want, but you haven't produced the result you want.
Well, Rome wasn't built in a day. Dealing with the African continent is a huge challenge.
Hundreds of millions of euros are getting poured into these countries and going into the hands of repressive governments. You know it, I know it.
Well, we both know it, and we know that this has to stop, and we have to fight corruption in Africa. But if you're trying to tell me that we shouldn't cooperate at all with African countries which don't match
I didn't say that.
Our level, well, this is what you're trying to hint at.
No, it isn't. I'm trying to say that you need to do things that bring about the results you want.
So lovely. So you agree that we have to deal with those governments which are in power, but of course we will support those countries with strong civil societies and those political forces who will be able to give African people the same benefits we enjoy in Europe.
David McAllister, you talk about corruption in Africa, but the EU has conspicuously failed to deal with corruption inside the bloc itself, inside the EU. Europe's dirty little secret is that it's not nearly as transparent, as honest as it likes to portray itself. If you look at this year's banking scandals, as much as $30 billion of Russian and former Soviet money, it's been laundered through the Estonian bank branch of Danske Bank, Dutch bank, ING, also forced to pay 775 million euros. A Latvian bank actually had to be closed because it was funding North Korea's nuclear program. So people are exploiting the enormous loopholes that have been left open in the European banking system. Why have you left open these loopholes?
Well, look, I'm not responsible for loopholes in the European banking system. These examples you have given...
You're a senior member of the European Parliament.
Of course, but these examples which have been given are unacceptable, and it's up to national governments and the European institutions if they are responsible to close these loopholes. But just coming back to what you said beforehand, the European Union is by large and by far the biggest donor of development aid in the world, and those who are criticizing the European Union outside the European Union should always ask themselves what they are doing. So I believe we still have to do more for Africa. We still have to do more for the so-called third world.
I understand that,
but please, other parts of the world could try to do a little more and follow the European line.
But perhaps hold yourselves to a higher standard here. Many more of these banking scandals are out there. Do you know how many full-time staff the European Banking Authority has working directly on money laundering?
Well, I'm happy to be on this show to find out now.
2. 2 people. Just 2 full-time staff. It's a joke, isn't it? It's not serious. You're turning a massive blind eye to money laundering within the European Union.
Well, I can't comment on this issue, but I'll be very sure to double-check these figures. I guess you also have probably people on the national level who are also responsible for this. But I don't want to protect anyone here. Money laundering is a serious offence, and of course the European Union and its member states has to work very hard that this doesn't repeat itself.
According to Transparency International, key European countries, members of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, are failing to implement it. This is one of the main instruments for fighting global cross-border corruption. If you look at their findings, Spain, little or no enforcement. France, limited enforcement. Ireland, little or no enforcement. Czech Republic, little or no enforcement. Austria, little or no enforcement. Is that a happy state of affairs?
Well, it certainly isn't a happy state of affairs, and I think
it's hypocrisy, isn't it?
And I think that these figures you just mentioned should be an initiative, should be something which national governments should take very seriously, and I'm also happy to address these issues here in the European Parliament.
Mr. McAllister, standards aren't helped when European judges allow MEPs like you to hide the details of their expenses instead of practicing transparency. The European Court of Justice has just ruled it would be a breach of MEPs' privacy if they had to provide the public with details of expenses, invoices, receipts, you know, like normal people. But the MEPs won't do that.
Well, this is a debate.
What's the message here? You can get away with anything here, can't you?
Well, this is a ruling of the European Court of Justice. This is a debate which has been where we're now following for several years in this European Parliament. The member states have different national standards. You have some countries where MEPs have to reveal every detail of the monthly allowance they get. In other countries, this is different.
4,416 euros per MEP in general expenses, which they don't have to account for. This is public money. What happened to the public's right to know?
To be honest, personally, I wouldn't have any problem if the rules were changed on this issue. But in the moment, this is the situation. But this is something really which will have to be decided between the group leaders and the presidency, and I would be follow any rule which is given on this issue.
But how can this decision do anything except encourage dishonesty and wastage? It can't, can it?
Well, no,
it's a step backwards for the European Union, which is trumpeting its values around the world, and then allows people to get away with It's accountability, isn't it? It's basic accountability that is being ignored here, isn't it?
Yes, but if I'm correctly informed, we have a very similar situation in the German Bundestag, and I have never heard criticism that German members of the German Bundestag weren't accountable for what they are doing. They get this monthly allowance, and for this money they can spend it on their office, on newspapers, on books, on whatever. And the question is if you are supposed to document this or not. If we start documenting this, which, if this is decided, I would certainly do, you would of course create an enormous new bureaucracy, because somebody would have to control what is the money being spent on, and are these actually true figures or not.
You talked earlier a little bit about Egypt. Aid to Egypt, I believe, EU assistance stands at about 1.3 billion euros, and there's a new allocation for 2017 to 2020, which is between 432 and 538 million euros. I think those are the figures. The European Parliament has passed resolution after resolution condemning the human rights abuses that have taken place in Egypt, and yet it continues to pour money in. It doesn't use the muscle it has to rein in these abuses, which go on day after day. People are being tortured, people are being sentenced to death, mass trials with 5 minutes per hearing, trials that do not live up to international standards. So why keep paying the oppressors in Egypt? Why not use the muscle you have to stop this kind of thing? Set benchmarks, but you don't.
The European Parliament has repeatedly sharply criticised human rights violations,
yes, it does.
for instance, in Egypt, and rightly so, because we believe human rights are universal and they apply to all human beings, not only to us in Europe. And the European Parliament is a worldwide known advocate for global human rights.
But that's my point. You just talk. You talk about it.
No,
you don't do anything.
No, that is not correct, because dealing with these countries, as I tried to explain to you, we have an approach more for more and less for less. Those countries who follow our way forward towards the human rights, the rule of law and democracy will get more support than others. But
these keep on getting support. Egypt keeps on getting support and does nothing to follow these rules.
We have the regime in Cairo, and we have to accept this regime. We have to strengthen civil society, the opposition and other responsible political forces who are in favour of more democracy and the rule of law. But in the meantime,
David McAllister. You know it isn't.
Diplomatic channels open. And what is the alternative? Not to deal at all with Egypt?
Cut the money back, set benchmarks, give them milestones to achieve before they get the next chance.
And then people like me will be sitting in your programme and you will be criticising us. Why aren't we not talking and dealing with the Africans? Once again, we can't choose our negotiation partners. Turkey, for instance, is a difficult negotiation partner, and still we struck a deal with Turkey, and since then the numbers are coming down. And of course we have to see that countries in Northern Africa and in the Middle East are also sharing a lot of burden when it comes to migration waves and the refugees. I mean, criticising Turkey is for one thing, and I'm always criticising the political situation in Turkey for good reasons. But on the other hand, I have to see that this country has sheltered millions of refugees coming from neighbouring countries.
We have to end it there. David McAllister, thanks very much for being on Conflict Zone.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.